Okay, so for this deep dive, we've got something really interesting lined up, especially for someone like you who enjoys thinking about these, big philosophical questions. And today we're going to be talking about privacy and how it all kind of plays out in this increasingly digital world we live in.
Yeah, and I think what can be kind of overwhelming with this topic is that there's just so much information out there.
Right.
But we've been looking at a really fascinating resource. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy actually has this amazing entry on privacy and information technology. It's a really comprehensive piece, and we're basically using that as kind of our guide for today's, exploration of this whole topic.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what we want to do today. We want to sort of get to that philosophical core of privacy, right? Especially as it bumps up against technology that's just constantly evolving.
Right.
So we'll be looking at the different ways philosophers have thought about privacy, the values that underpin it, the real challenges that come with this whole information technology thing, and even some of the, technological solutions that are out there. I think what's really striking is just how much debate there is around all this.
Yeah.
The meaning of privacy and even its importance seem to be constantly in flux, especially in this digital age.
Right.
It's where do we even draw the line anymore?
And it's not a new anxiety either. If you think back to even the late 19th century, you have new technologies, the printing press, photography, and it was sparking all these concerns. I mean, that's when Warren and Brandeis came up with that idea of the right to be left alone, with the concept of inviolate personality. It's really interesting to look back and see how these shifts in technology almost force us to rethink what privacy even means.
Yeah, that's a good point. And even today, right, we have these different conceptions of privacy floating around. The sources we've been looking at make this the key distinction between what they call constitutional privacy, which is more about those, very personal decisions we make, free from interference.
Yeah.
But what we're really digging into today is this idea of tort privacy or informational privacy.
Exactly.
So what's that all about?
So informational privacy, it's essentially about our interest in controlling who has access to information about us. Think about it. What do you choose to share on social media, right? It's kind of a good example because once it's out there, how much control do you really have over it? It's a bit of a slippery slope.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And this brings up those, privacy statements we see everywhere. Sometimes it feels like they're just describing how our data is being handled, a snapshot of the current situation. But then other times they seem to be taking a moral stance, this is how your information should be used, these ethical boundaries.
Yeah. Right. And that distinction is really key because on the one hand, you have this descriptive aspect and then you have this normative side, which is where things get really philosophical. Normative informational privacy, as the encyclopedia entry puts it, is really about this idea of a moral right. And it's important to note, it's not absolute, but this moral right to kind of govern access to our information. How it's collected, the technologies that are used to process it. It's pretty complex, actually.
Absolutely. And there are these, wildly different reactions to how technology is impacting all of this. You have people who are just privacy is dead, get over it. It's almost this sense of resignation, especially in, tech circles.
Right.
But then on the other hand, you have people who believe that privacy is, more important now than ever before. And we've got to fight to protect it.
And it's interesting because even within that view, within that pro-privacy perspective, there's this really interesting philosophical debate about why privacy is valuable in the first place. So you've got these reductionist accounts, right? And they basically argue that privacy's value isn't fundamental. It's not intrinsic. Instead, it comes from other values that we hold dear, like property rights, security, autonomy, intimacy, even, the health of a democratic society. Their point is that we should understand privacy's importance by linking it to these other things that we already consider valuable.
Right. So it's privacy is important because it helps us achieve these other goals. But then you have the, what do they call it? The non-reductionist view. And they're saying, no. Privacy has this inherent value. It's almost like a basic human right.
Exactly. And then you have those in between, the cluster accounts. They're basically saying, look, there's not necessarily one single essence of privacy. They recognize that there are all these moral claims tied up with privacy, without trying to reduce it to just one thing. It's more about acknowledging that there's this family of related ethical concerns.
Yeah, that makes sense because, experiencing privacy or the lack of it can feel so different depending on the situation you're in. Now, there's this one account that I found really, really fascinating. It's the neo-Republican view, which kind of ties privacy to freedom as non-domination. Have you come across that one?
Yeah, and I think it's a really good lens to look at this whole digital age through. It's based on Pettit's work. And the idea is that when anyone, corporations or governments, when they collect tons of data about us, it creates this like power imbalance. And even if that data isn't being misused right now, the fact that they have it, that they could potentially use it arbitrarily, that's a problem. So data protection, in this view, it's like a shield against this potential for like data-driven domination.
It's like that whole, philosophical problem of the panopticon, the idea that even if you're not being watched at any given moment, the feeling of being watched, the potential for it, can change how you act.
Yeah.
So having all our data collected, even for things that seem harmless today, it puts us in this position where we're like potentially subject to the decisions of whoever has that data.
Exactly, yeah. And then there's another account, these epistemic accounts, that really focus on the knowledge aspect of privacy. So in this view, having privacy means that there are certain things, certain propositions about you that other people just don't know. It's about maintaining control over what others know about you.
That's interesting. So like it boils down to a relationship between me, the things I want to keep private, and who I want to keep in the dark about them.
Yeah, it's a triadic relation involving a subject, a set of private propositions, and a set of individuals, who you want to keep those propositions hidden from. And the entry also points out this interesting difference between the European approach, which is more about data protection, and the U.S. approach, which centers more on the idea of privacy. The argument is that data protection actually gives us a clearer picture of, what it is we're trying to protect, which is this specific entity, this personal data, and also gives us a better idea of the technical means we can use to protect it. So it's almost like informational privacy gets reframed as this whole concept of data protection.
Right, like focusing on the data itself gives us a better framework for figuring out regulations and tech solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've talked about different ways of thinking about privacy, but now let's talk about how information technology is like totally changing the game. The speed and scale of it all, it's almost hard to wrap your head around. Things like, Moore's Law?
Oh, absolutely. We're dealing with quantities of data that were like unimaginable even just a few decades ago. I mean, the entry actually has this like mind-blowing statistic. If you tried to store 100 exabytes of data on CDs, you'd end up with a stack that would reach almost to the moon.
Whoa.
Right. It's hard to even picture. And this exponential growth in our ability to store, process, and share information, it's changing everything.
Yeah, and this increased connectivity. I mean, it's great for so many things, like being able to access information, connect with people. But it really does challenge those like traditional ideas of privacy. If information can flow so freely, be accessed so easily, we really have to think about whether all this access is actually a good thing and how we can like even begin to govern it, whether it's through technology, legal frameworks, or just like social norms.
Yeah. And it's not just about access being easy. It's about what that access allows people to do, because access to personal information, it gives people power to act. And that's where things get dicey. That's where you start to see the potential for harm, like inequality, discrimination, even threats to our autonomy. Think about those malicious actors out there, or all the times we just kind of unknowingly trade privacy for convenience online, or even how data can be used for things like discriminatory hiring practices.
Yeah. There are a lot of ways it can go wrong. Let's talk about some specific technologies. Starting with, like, the internet itself. It was originally designed as this open network, mostly for scientists to share information. They weren't really thinking about privacy, like building in these mechanisms to keep information separate or secure.
Right.
And then along comes the World Wide Web, and suddenly it's a whole different ball game.
Right. It was kind of like an unexpected consequence. And social network sites, even those that started small, like academic communities, they didn't really prioritize privacy from the get-go either. There was this like assumption of trust among users. So a lot of those privacy features, they were added later on as people started raising concerns.
Yeah, it's like they were playing catch-up. And cookies are a great example of this whole evolution.
Yeah.
At first, they were meant for like harmless things, personalizing websites, making things more user-friendly. But pretty quickly, they became these powerful tools for tracking us all over the web. And then there are those consent pop-ups.
Right.
You know the ones. Yeah. They're everywhere. And it feels like they're more about like checking a box than actually giving us control.
Yeah, a lot of the time those consent interfaces, they're designed to just get us to click agree, without us really understanding what we're agreeing to, all that data collection. And then there are those social media buttons that you see embedded on other websites, like the like buttons and all that.
Mm-hmm.
They might seem convenient, but they can leak data about our browsing back to those platforms, even if we don't click on them.
Yeah, that's sneaky. And then there's cloud computing, which is, storing data and even running software on remote servers is like this whole other layer of like, where is my information even physically located? What laws apply to it? Who can access it, including governments? And then there's the whole issue of how the data we generate and the data that the system itself generates is being used. You can feel really murky.
Yeah. And that lack of transparency is a big concern. Users often have very limited visibility into what's actually happening with their data, who it's being shared with. And often the only real option you have is to just not use the service at all, which isn't always practical.
Yeah.
And as the entry points out, this is a really big issue with newer technologies like large language models. Some regions are even banning or restricting them because of a potential violations of data protection principles.
Like a whole new frontier of privacy concerns. And moving to social media specifically, the issue isn't just about who can see our posts. It goes deeper than that. It's about the fact that we're constantly being invited to share tons of personal information. These platforms incentivize us to create these really detailed profiles.
Right.
Almost like they're gamifying the whole self-disclosure thing.
Absolutely. We're constantly being tempted to trade our data and even our attention for these benefits, for these connections.
Right.
And sometimes it's not even clear what we're giving away. Like those like buttons, they seem so harmless, but they all contribute to this bigger picture, these tracking profiles.
Yeah, it's all connected. So what can we do about all of this? I mean, one thing I can think of is stricter default privacy settings, making it harder to share information widely without, really consciously choosing to do so.
Right.
But then that could impact the usability of the platform, right?
Exactly. It's a trade-off. And even something as subtle as whether a platform uses an opt-in versus an opt-out approach for data sharing, that can have a huge impact on user behavior. And a lot of the time, it's designed to benefit the platform, not the user.
Totally. Okay, so let's talk about artificial intelligence and big data. This is something that a lot of people see as a really serious and growing threat to privacy. I mean, the sheer amount of data being collected and the rapidly increasing power of processing, it all adds up to surveillance and profiling on a scale we've never seen before. It's like this surveillance capitalism like Shoshana Zuboff talks about, where our online activity isn't just generating the data we explicitly provide, but also all this metadata. Our clicks, our searches, our browsing history, it's all being tracked.
And it's all being analyzed. I mean, there are these incredibly sophisticated data mining techniques out there that can take all of this information and create really detailed user profiles.
Right, and it's not just for advertising anymore. These profiles can be used to figure out all sorts of sensitive information about us, political affiliations, health concerns, even our creditworthiness. And the really scary part is when this information starts impacting us in the offline world. Things like being denied insurance or facing discrimination in hiring. And because these profiling algorithms are so opaque, it can be almost impossible to understand why decisions are being made about us, let alone challenge them.
Yeah, it's really troubling. And this isn't just happening online either. Big data and AI are being used everywhere. Personalized shopping recommendations, public surveillance systems with facial recognition, even smart card systems tracking our movements and purchases. It's kind of pointing towards a future where this comprehensive citizen profiling becomes the norm. Decisions being made about us based on these profiles. It's a lot to think about.
It is.
Yeah.
And there's also the question of informed consent. How can we even give informed consent when data collection is happening in the background, often without us even knowing?
Right.
Like with a lot of surveillance technologies. And then there's function creep, where data that was originally collected for one purpose ends up being used for something totally different, something we never agreed to. Like think about DNA databases. They were initially created for forensic purposes, but now they're being used for all sorts of other things.
It's a slippery slope. And then you have all the unique privacy issues around genetic and genomic data. We now have the ability to predict future health risks, which raises all these questions about whether people should even have access to all the information that can be gathered about them. Like the right to access versus the right not to know.
Yeah, and that's a tough one. And we can't forget about large language models. They're developing so rapidly, and there are all these potential privacy risks, like leaking the huge data sets they're trained on. And while there are efforts to create AI regulations and things like, what's it called, explainable AI, those efforts come with their own complexities and vulnerabilities.
It's a moving target, for sure. Okay, so moving on, our phones, I mean, they've become these incredibly powerful data collection tools, right?
Yeah.
GPS, movement trackers, cameras, they're constantly collecting and transmitting information about where we are, what we're doing.
It's kind of crazy when you think about it. And location data, I mean, that's particularly sensitive because it's so directly tied to our physical presence, our movement.
Right, exactly.
It can reveal a lot of really personal information about our lives, and it can be misused in all sorts of harmful ways, from stalking to burglary. It's not just about the cameras either.
Right.
Because these days technology is so reconfigurable, people might not even be aware of when those sensors are active, when they're collecting data. It's like you can't always assume that people are aware of what their devices are doing.
Yeah, and it's not just about our personal devices either. It's the whole Internet of things, right?
Right.
We're surrounded by all these interconnected devices, RFID chips in our passports, products, smart home devices. It's everywhere.
Yeah, it's like this whole network of silent data collection going on around us.
And even those simple RFID tags that just transmit a unique identifier, they can be used for tracking once they're linked to an individual. And then all those smart home devices, I mean, think about it. Meters, thermostats, they're constantly monitoring our homes, generating data about our habits and routines.
It's kind of unsettling when you think about it.
And then you've got this trend towards service-oriented provisioning, where companies are remotely monitoring how we're using their products. We need more transparency about all of this. Are there microphones embedded in these devices? What's happening with the data they collect?
Like, where does it end? And let's not forget about e-government. The way governments are using technology is changing things dramatically.
Yeah.
Biometric passports, online services, electronic voting systems.
Right.
It's all connected to privacy.
Absolutely. And electronic voting in particular. I mean, that highlights the importance of the secret ballot, right? That principle of being able to vote without anyone knowing how you voted. We need things like receipt freeness, coercion resistance. Technology can help with things like voter verification, but ensuring privacy in mail-in or online voting, it's a big challenge.
Yeah, for sure. And, more broadly, the whole concept of privacy is so crucial for a functioning democracy. Being able to hold our own beliefs, have private discussions. It protects us from things like, targeted misinformation campaigns, which are just so easy to spread online. It's so much harder to keep our preferences and activities private in the digital world compared to the offline world. And then you have surveillance, which, thanks to technology, is more powerful than ever before. CCTV systems with facial recognition, data collection from the Internet of Things, it's all coming together.
Right. It all adds up to this really comprehensive and constant monitoring.
And the idea of surveillance capitalism really gets at the heart of the problem. Many online systems are designed to gather massive amounts of data, both the data we give them willingly and the data that's passively collected about us. And then they use this data to build predictive models.
Right.
And while a lot of this is for, targeted advertising, it can also be used for things that are much more manipulative, like fraud detection or influencing elections with micro-targeted messaging. It's all a bit Big Brother-ish,
Definitely. And those collaborations between government agencies and for-profit companies, those large-scale data initiatives that involve really sensitive information,
right,
that's really concerning from a privacy perspective.
It is. And even when government surveillance by intelligence or law enforcement agencies is justified on the grounds of national security, it's still something that should be debated in a democratic society. Because these programs are so secretive, it's really difficult for anyone outside the government to know whether they're actually justified, whether they're proportional to the threat. And then there's the whole debate about encryption.
Right.
Governments wanting backdoors for surveillance. It highlights that tension between security and privacy. Because weakening encryption for surveillance purposes also makes everyone less secure overall.
Yeah, it's a tough balance. Okay, so we've talked about all the ways that IT can be a threat to privacy, but we should also talk about how technology can be part of the solution. There's a growing movement towards designing systems with privacy in mind right from the start. It's not just about adding it on as an afterthought.
Right, like baking it into the design. I've heard about things like value-sensitive design.
Right. Exactly. It's a structured approach for making sure human values, like privacy, are considered throughout the entire design process. And then there's privacy by design. It's a framework developed by Anne Cavoukian that emphasizes data protection being integrated into every stage of a product or service's development.
Okay.
So it's not just about like bolting on privacy features at the end. It's about thinking about it from the very beginning.
That makes sense.
And privacy impact assessments are becoming more common too. It's a way to systematically evaluate the potential privacy impacts of a new project or system. The idea is to make sure that privacy is considered throughout the development process. And we also have things like industry guidelines and standards like the PCI DSS, which is for payment cards and different ISO standards. They offer best practices for making sure systems are privacy friendly, especially in the realm of information security. And then you have those high-level principles that are part of the GDPR in Europe. Things like transparency, purpose limitation, proportionality. They're really good, technology neutral guiding principles.
They are. But I can also imagine it's hard to translate those high-level principles into concrete design choices, right?
Yeah.
Something like transparent design can probably be interpreted in a lot of different ways. And even when people have the best intentions, vulnerabilities and bugs can slip through during implementation. And then actually verifying that a system protects privacy in the way it's supposed to, that can be a pretty difficult technical challenge.
Oh, for sure. And then you've got solutions aimed at users. Things like privacy settings that are easier to understand, more granular control, and tools that actually teach people about the risks. But then there's the whole issue of moral overload. If you bombard people with too many choices, too many complex policies, it just becomes overwhelming. I think design thinking has a big role to play here, really understanding people's needs and values and translating those into the design.
Yeah, it's got to be user-friendly.
Right.
So what about things like, what are they called? PETs? Privacy-enhancing technologies.
Right. Those are really interesting. They're essentially tools and techniques that are meant to give people more privacy, often by allowing them to be anonymous or use pseudonyms online, like Tor and Freenet.
Oh, yeah. Heard of those.
They use cryptography and clever routing to hide where online communications are coming from and where they're going. And they often use techniques like k-anonymity, which basically makes sure that an individual can't be singled out in a data set. But PETs aren't perfect. They can be vulnerable to attacks, especially from well-funded actors. And they can be tough for the average person to set up and use correctly. And then there's always the risk of malware on a user's computer that can completely undermine the whole point of using these tools in the first place.
That makes sense.
And then you've got data anonymization techniques, which are about removing identifying information from data sets before they're used or shared. But, making data truly anonymous while still making it useful for analysis, that's a really tough problem because there are all these sophisticated statistical methods out there, and you can often combine seemingly anonymized data sets with other information that's publicly available, and suddenly you can re-identify individuals.
Wow.
It's a cat and mouse game. But there are people working on solutions like k-anonymity and a whole field called statistical disclosure control. They're coming up with things like synthetic data generation and differential privacy, which involves adding noise to data to protect privacy.
That's fascinating.
And then there's cryptography, which has been used to protect data for a long time. Things like HTTPS and VPNs rely on modern cryptography to secure communications. But you have to use it correctly, and you have to stay up to date because old cryptographic schemes can become vulnerable.
Right, it's like an arms race.
Yeah, and some newer developments, like homomorphic encryption, have a lot of potential. It actually allows you to process encrypted data without decrypting it first, which could be huge for privacy-preserving analysis.
Wow.
It's still facing some performance issues, but there are new variants like somewhat homomorphic encryption that are making it more practical. And then there's blockchain technology. While it's primarily about making sure data is accurate and can't be changed, it's also being used for things like anonymous cryptocurrencies and systems where people have more control over their digital identities.
Yeah, that whole self-sovereign identity thing is really interesting. And this brings up another important point, which is identity management. Online identifiers are becoming increasingly important these days.
Right.
Those single sign-on frameworks, like using your Facebook or Google account to log into other websites, they're really convenient, but they can also be risky for privacy because they're linking all our activity together and making it easier for companies to build those really detailed profiles of us.
They are convenient, yeah, but all that data gets centralized, which can make it easier to track people across different services. And when you combine that with things like cookies and tracking pixels, it becomes even easier to build those profiles. There are some more privacy-friendly alternatives out there, like attribute-based authentication.
Okay.
That's where you get access to something based on your attributes, without having to reveal your identity directly. And then, as you mentioned, there's the whole self-sovereign identity concept where people have more control over their digital identities. They're not relying on those traditional third-party providers.
So it's like we're at this crossroads,
right?
Technology is challenging our understanding of privacy in ways we never imagined, but it's also giving us the tools to potentially solve these problems.
Absolutely. And our values, our understanding of privacy, all of that influences how we think about responsibility.
Right, like who's responsible for protecting privacy? Is it individuals? Is it companies? Is it governments? It's a really complex question.
Yeah, and there are new technologies coming out all the time that have the potential to completely change how we think about privacy. Things like brain-computer interfaces.
Whoa, yeah. That's a whole other level.
Right. I mean, imagine a future where our thoughts aren't even private anymore.
It's almost like science fiction.
I know. It's a bit mind-blowing. And neuroscientists are starting to raise concerns about AI and its ability to access what they call our locus internus, which is like our inner thoughts, our unspoken preferences.
Mm-hmm.
Our current legal frameworks might not even be equipped to deal with that. And there are some people who are calling for a new category of rights, neuro rights, which would protect our mental privacy, including a right to cognitive liberty, the freedom to choose how we think. It's really fascinating.
It is. And it's not just about technology impacting privacy. It's about technology shaping our norms around what we even consider private, like all the oversharing that happens on social media, for example.
Right.
It makes you wonder if these platforms are changing our willingness to share personal information.
Right.
And then there's the argument that maybe the best way to protect privacy is through transparency and accountability. So instead of just trying to hide information, we should be demanding that anyone who collects and uses our data has to justify what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
The open source movement, with its emphasis on transparency in software development, I think that has a role to play here as well. And there's this interesting concept called the precautionary principle.
Right.
It's something that comes from environmental ethics. The idea is that if there's a chance of serious and irreversible harm, even if we don't have all the scientific evidence yet, we should err on the side of caution. So applying this to information technology, it means that the burden of proof should be on the people developing these technologies to show that they won't cause significant harm, including privacy violations. But then applying that principle to social effects and human actions, I mean, that's a whole other can of worms. You have to balance it with things like informed consent and individual autonomy.
Yeah, it's definitely not simple, but it's a conversation we need to be having. And at the end of the day, the question of who's responsible for protecting privacy,
Right.
That's a really difficult one because we tend to put a lot of the responsibility on individuals, right? We tell them they need to make choices about their data, their online behavior. But then you have the privacy paradox. People say they care about privacy, but then their actions don't always reflect that.
Right. It's like a disconnect between our stated beliefs and our behavior.
And part of that might be due to how things are designed. Those dark patterns that trick people into revealing more information than they intended.
Yeah, those are really manipulative.
They are. So it's not just about individual choice. The environment we're making choices in also plays a huge role. And maybe we should start thinking about privacy as more of a common good, something that requires collective action.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea.
Because ultimately, a lot of the harms from privacy violations aren't just about individuals. They affect society as a whole.
That's a good point. And I think it's important to remember that the impact of information technology goes way beyond privacy.
Right.
Things like friendship, community, happiness, fairness, they're all affected by how we design and use these technologies. So when we're thinking about design, when we're doing those impact assessments, we need to be considering all of these values, not just privacy in isolation.
Absolutely. It's about the big picture.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, it's pretty clear that the relationship between privacy and information technology is incredibly complex and constantly changing. We've talked about the philosophical underpinnings of privacy, the threats that come with technological advancements, and even the potential for technology to help us protect privacy.
And for someone like you with your philosophical background, I hope it's clear that these aren't just technical issues. They're philosophical issues that are going to keep evolving alongside technology. And the debates about the meaning of privacy, its value, how to protect it in the digital age, those aren't going away anytime soon.
Right. There's still a lot to figure out. And on that note, I'm going to leave you with a final thought to ponder.
Okay.
You know that epistemic account of privacy we were talking about? Well, think about how AI is getting better and better at inferring our thoughts, beliefs, and intentions. Does that change what we even consider a private proposition?